developing. And I really think it's quite encouraging that we get more and more interest, more and more people registering. This hall is full, despite the early time. This is really encouraging because we have important topics to discuss, and even more essentially, we have important things to do. So we need high interest and people who care about humanitarian issues. Today's topic, humanitarian aid under fire. Unfortunately, we only have to open any newspaper or watch a news program to understand the urgency and the relevance of this topic. If as humanitarians our ambition is to save lives and to alleviate suffering, we have to constantly question ourselves and our actions. We have to ask ourselves if the work that we do is really as good as it can be, if the aid that we deliver really reaches the people who need it. We have to constantly question ourselves and ask ourselves how we can improve. And this is why we are here today. Exchange among experts from different organizations, exchange with politicians, with the media, with the public is key to improve. We have to share lessons learned, we have to share best practices, we have to face critical questioning, critical feedback in order to improve. So this is also why we encourage you to really participate and ask all the questions that come to your mind. But while we are discussing today, let's not forget, it's not about us, it's not about our organizations and the differences, it's not about our personal ambitions or experiences. It really is about the people who need the support, about the men, women and children trapped in Syria or in South Sudan, in the Central African Republic, or very close from here in Ukraine and all the other conflict zones. It's also about those people trying to find safety for themselves and their families, find dignity, and who are trapped or mistreated or dying on their way to find this security. So your questions will be key to the success of this day, of the discussions of today. So we really want this to be participatory. We have reserved 30 minutes at the end of each panel to take your questions. Don't be shy, you know, there's not such a thing as a stupid question. We have 2 microphones per hall. So while you hear the discussion at the panel and the short statements in the beginning, take your notes and ask everything you want to ask. We are going to have 7 panels in total. The first one will be here in this main hall. After that, we are going to split into 2 panels at the same time, one here, one in the hall next door. They will be in parallel. The discussions here in this hall will can be followed by live stream as well. There is the possibility to ask questions on the Twitter wall via hashtag Humanitarian Congress. You find all the information about the Twitter wall and the streaming on the website of the Congress. If you have any questions regarding the organization, we have our volunteers wearing black t-shirts around. They will be happy to answer all the questions you have. Please take in mind we have a very full program today, so we really want to start the panels on time. So after the breaks, please come a few minutes early and take your seats so that we really can have all the discussions that we want to have. An important last point, please turn off the ringtone of your mobile phones so that we're not interrupted. And at this point, I'm very happy to hand over to Annelies Willim, Director of the Globale Verantwortung, Global Responsibility, the Austrian platform for development and humanitarian aid, for her opening words.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, distinguished guests. It's a really, really great pleasure for me to open this third Humanitarian Congress here in Vienna, which is held again under the patronage of Mr. President of Austria, the Federal President of Austria, Dr. Heinz Fischer. And it is also a very great honor for me to welcome today Her Excellency, Ms. Kyung-wha Kang, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator of the United Nations. Your Excellency, let me thank you in the name of Austrian humanitarian organizations. It's great that you are here today. Thank you very much. Also, I would like to thank Mr. Minister Hunsdorfer, the Austrian President of Social Affairs, Minister of Social Affairs, oh, sorry, and for being here today. And also I would like to thank His Excellency Peter Lonsky-Tiefenthal. He is Director General for the Department of Development Cooperation and Humanitarian Aid at the Austrian Ministry of Europe for Integration and Foreign Affairs. Yes, and let me also thank all the international experts from Austria and from abroad that have come here, that have come to join us in order to share their experience with us. Let me thank the facilitators who will enhance fruitful discussions and also the volunteers, as Irene already mentioned. And I have to add, it would not have been possible to operate this Congress because we cannot pay any fees, so all the participants on the panels, the speakers, the facilitators, and the volunteers render their services free of charge. Thank you for this. And last but not least, I would like to thank the organizing and co-organizing humanitarian organizations of Austria who have organized this Congress, and also my colleagues from the organizational committee, as well as the online newspaper, Der Standard.at, and our sponsors. So it's really a great moment to stand in front of you and to be in the very beginning of this Congress and to speak to you. Thank you very much for coming, ladies and gentlemen. Due to ever worse and more frequent natural disasters, political crises, and political conflicts, more people than ever need humanitarian aid. And at this very moment, we talk about millions of people who are in desperate need of humanitarian aid. At the same time, however, we see and we notice that the circumstances for providing this humanitarian aid are deteriorating. They have become more difficult. Humanitarian aid is challenged. It is challenged by international politics, by national politics, and by regional politics. The access to victims has become much more difficult. It has become a challenging task as well. To put it short, humanitarian aid is under fire. But to tell you something, ladies and gentlemen, this is unacceptable. It is simply unacceptable. So what could be done? To my opinion, we need, first of all, what we need is political decisions. We need political actions. We need those decisions that give that priority to humanitarian aid that it deserves. And this, of course, includes appropriate funding, but it also includes activities on diplomatic level. So what we need is, we need politicians to stop paying lip services and to really commit themselves. And this is something I wish for Austria as well. Austria's spending on humanitarian aid and development cooperation, as you well know, ranks very low compared to Mr. Hunsdorfer, Your Excellency, Mr. Lonsky-Tiefenthal, The government has set, in its government accord, has set the path. And I call on the government, and I call on you personally, please stay to your commitment, stay to your words, and finally raise the fund for the Foreign Disaster Relief Fund to 20 million euro in Austria. Because in times of dramatically increasing humanitarian need in countries like Ukraine, Syria, Iraq, or the Central African Republic, it is, just to name a few, it is time to act, and it's really time to act now. And let's never forget, humanitarian aid is not about charity, it is a human right. I wish you an inspiring and interesting day, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Annelies, for your very clear words. I would like now ask Rudolf Hundsdorfer, Minister for Social Affairs, for his opening words. Thank you, Mr. Hundsdorfer.
Good morning also from my side, and Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, we will do our homework. Yes, we will do our homework. We know the situation. We know we must do a little bit more. We must do more, we know. But thank you very much that I can stand now here. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to the Humanitarian Congress here in Vienna. You may wonder why the Austrian Minister for Social Affairs has been invited to open this event. Today we are seeing a growing number of armed conflicts, national disasters, and the crisis hit poor and socially disadvantaged people the hardest. Women, children, people with disabilities, the sick and the disadvantaged often urgently need humanitarian aid, and it is these groups that my ministry is particularly dedicated to supporting. However, humanitarian aid in a global context is not only an issue for foreign or social ministers, but for all of our societies. Austria has a long-standing record to helping people in humanitarian crisis. Large and effective campaigns were launched immediately after disasters, such, for example, as the tsunami in Southeast Asia and the earthquake in Haiti, the collect donation for the affected populations. Of course, Austrian humanitarian aid does not take place in isolation, but forms part of a context that includes international disasters relief, emergency humanitarian measures, rehabilitation, reconstruction, and development cooperation. My ministry, for example, funds development projects in the area of social and employment policy in countries like the Republic of Moldova, Ukraine, or Bosnia-Herzegovina. We also have 3 social attachés providing assistance through the transfer of know-how in these policy areas to countries in Southeast Europe. The Austrian government intends to further strengthen its support for humanitarian aid, and it is eager to implement its commitment as soon as budgetary requirements allow. A number of Austrian NGOs are engaged in delivering humanitarian aid. I would like to take this opportunity to thank these organizations for their excellent work, which often takes place in dangerous areas and after difficult circumstances. And I would also like to thank the 360,000 volunteers committed to providing disasters and emergency relief for their work on behalf of people in need, be it in Austria or abroad. Ladies and gentlemen, this spirit, let me wish you a productive Congress and a stimulating discussion. Thank you very much.
Mr. Hundsdorfer, thank you for this statement. I would now ask His Excellency Peter Lansky-Tiefenthal, Ambassador, and
to Vienna. We had the opportunity to have a longer conversation last night, and another conversation this morning with the Director General of the International Red Cross, Monsieur Daccord. And I think in both the conversation, the spirit that all of you reflect, the energy that you put behind humanitarian assistance is so visible and is so tangible and is so urgently needed that only requires the additional resources that Ms. Phillim talked about. And I think there's not a day when we don't think about what we can do to increase those resources in the light of the large number of crises that we are facing. At the outset, let me thank the organizers of this Congress, Global Responsibility, the Austrian Red Cross, the Caritas Austria, and Doctors Without Borders. I'd like to thank you for your enthusiasm that you put behind organizing this Congress. Only a couple of weeks ago did I have the opportunity for the last time to see for myself what it means to live in a camp for internally displaced persons in Baharka in northern Iraq on the outskirts of Erbil. To see the needs of the people, to see their hope, their expectations, and also to see the amazing work that all of you are doing to try every single day to lend human dignity to people's lives under very difficult circumstances. And it's that work, I think, that shows the way for us who try to help you and support you from the point of view of the government. More people than ever, and it's been mentioned early on, are uprooted by violence. In 2013 alone, more than 50 million people, the largest number ever, was on the move, either as internally displaced or as refugees, the largest number since the end of the Second World War. That worsening humanitarian crisis also brought about the largest ever requirement for financial support. And the projected amount for 2015 at this stage, early on in the year, is $16.5 billion, and likely to go up in the light of what's happening in the world. Apart from funding, serious other challenges remain for humanitarian work on the ground. Reaching people in need is at the core of effective humanitarian action. Humanitarian access is very often limited by violence against humanitarian workers. Unfortunately, there too the numbers are at the highest level ever, with 474 humanitarian workers being attacked, killed, abducted, or injured. In one of your latest briefings, Assistant Secretary General Kang, to the UN Security Council on the humanitarian situation in Syria, you gave a very graphic description of the impediments regarding the delivery of humanitarian assistance. You spoke of indiscriminate attacks on civilians. You spoke about the blockade of humanitarian aid and of basic services, the removal of vital supplies from convoys, and the obstructive administrative procedures that stand in the way of humanitarian assistance. I think that shows how pertinent and how timely your Congress is, and how pertinent the theme is that you've given your deliberations, humanitarian aid under fire. I wish you, on behalf of the Minister for Europe Integration and International Affairs, Sebastian Kurz, very successful and productive deliberations, and for all our friends and colleagues from abroad, that you may also have a couple of minutes to walk through the streets of Vienna. You've brought us the sun, you've brought us the spring, and I hope you'll get a chance to experience that as well. So thank you very, very much, and all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lansky-Tiefenthal. It's certainly encouraging to hear that there are reflections going on. in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on how to increase the Austrian contribution. We are certainly going to stay in contact and have lively debates on that in the future as well. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the first panel. And first of all, we are going to hear the keynote speech by Her Excellency Mrs. Kyung-wha Kang. Thank you very much for being here with us today. You will be sharing with us your expert opinion and your observation on the interaction of international politics and humanitarian aid. So please give a warm welcome to Her Excellency Ms. Kang. To take a seat, because we are going right after the keynote speech, we are going into the discussion. So please, Yves Daccord, Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Please welcome Mr. Daccord. And a warm welcome also to Wolfgang Petritsch, former UN High Representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So now, please give your full attention to Her Excellency Ms. Kang.
Thank you very much, Irene, for that very warm introduction. Thank you, Anneliese, for a great welcome yesterday and your very no-nonsense, pointed remarks about how to enhance the profile of Austria in the global humanitarian endeavor. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Ambassador, for your welcoming remarks, in particular to the Ambassador, who's a good friend and a good friend of the United Nations. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am truly honored and delighted to join you for the 3rd Vienna Humanitarian Congress under the theme Humanitarian Aid Under Fire. I am deeply grateful to the Austrian Red Cross and the NGOs for organizing this annual event, which I believe is instrumental in enhancing Austria's profile in the humanitarian sector. I am also very, very happy to see some key actors from the ground, and in particular, Bishop Nzaparainga, I hope that I have that pronunciation correct, and also the Imam, Mr. Laima Umar Kobine from the Central African Republic. The two are here. Thank you very much. I had the honor of speaking with the 2 religious leaders in the Central African Republic, which we all know is still in a very protracted conflict-related crisis. And the 2 religious leaders are doing their utmost to bring about social cohesion, to overcome the divisiveness and the sectarian divide that is fueling this conflict in the Central African Republic. Ladies and gentlemen, wearing my previous hat in human rights, I had the pleasure of visiting this beautiful city many times, in fact, to bask in the deep commitment of the leaders and civil society to universal human rights. And as we all know, that commitment in 1992 provided fertile grounds for the creation of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is where I served 6 years plus as the deputy. And the personal transition from human rights to humanitarian work has been immensely inspiring and humbling, invigorating and frustrating at the same time. And I'm just very privileged to have been a part of both communities at the global level, particularly at a time when the two are increasingly putting minds and hearts together, as exemplified in the Secretary General's Rights Upfront initiative for the greater protection and dignity of the people that we are meant to serve. Thus, I'm delighted now to return to this city and this university of great beauty and history, wearing my current hat in humanitarian affairs. And standing here before many delegates and speakers whose professional dedication to the humanitarian enterprise long predates mine, I can only hope that my 2 years in the office that is tasked to coordinate the multilateral response to the humanitarian crises of our times has given me some insights and observations that would be worth sharing with all of you today. Ladies and gentlemen, the organizers of this conference have chosen a theme that aptly captures the soul-searching, I would say, among humanitarians these days: humanitarian aid under fire. Indeed, a climate of existential crisis currently seems to permeate the humanitarian community. Perhaps by nature, the humanitarian work of trying to assist and protect the most vulnerable and downtrodden of our fellow human beings is inherently sobering and could be even apocalyptic. But even so, the sense of being at a critical moment with an uncertain future seems particularly intense these days. And there are, I believe, a number of trends that have been added up to this collective sense of being under fire and unable to reach victims as much as we want to and should. First of all, humanitarian aid is literally under fire. Humanitarians are no longer safe in undertaking the selfless deed of helping others in need. In the conflict-related protracted emergencies where humanitarians struggle to deliver assistance to the suffering people, aid workers are routinely harassed, attacked, kidnapped, and killed. In 2013 alone, 155 aid workers were killed in the major crises around the world. The UN blue flag no longer provides a shield of protection against terrorists or armed actors, and even the Red Cross and Red Crescent emblems cannot ensure sanctuary for the wounded and the sick. Medical facilities and workers have become routine targets for bombing and shelling and violent attacks, for example, in Syria, Sudan, and South Sudan. The growing insecurity of humanitarian work is not a distinct phenomenon, but forms part of a broader trend of rising levels of brutality and casual disregard for human life and dignity that have come to characterize today's armed conflict. And when 1.5 billion people live in conflict-affected and fragile states, when over 75% of these crises that require international humanitarian response are armed conflicts or complex emergencies, we will, unfortunately, have to face more stories in the media about aid workers killed in the line of duty of atrocities committed against innocent civilians. And this brings me to my second point. Time-honored humanitarian principles and norms are facing an onslaught of blatant violations with only the vaguest hope of bringing the perpetrators to account. The principles of distinction between civilians and combatants, and the proportionality of means to ends in military operations as enshrined in international humanitarian law, as well as the inherent dignity and rights of all people, in peace times as well as in war, as enshrined in international human rights law, have been swept aside in the greatest humanitarian catastrophe of our times, which is taking place inside Syria. But the protection of civilians is also under threat in many other conflict-related crises in Sudan, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ukraine, to name just a few. Indeed, it is ironic that after 15 years of Security Council engagement on the issue of protection of civilians, with numerous landmark resolutions and strengthened mandates in many peacekeeping missions, the actual task of protecting civilians in armed conflict on the ground has become more and more onerous as the scale and level of brutality and violence committed by armed actors against civilians have continued to rise. International law is clear. Parties to conflict are responsible for protecting and meeting the the basic needs of people under their control. Consent for relief operations must never be withheld or on arbitrary grounds. And if parties are unable or unwilling to provide adequate assistance, they should allow and facilitate rapid, safe, and unimpeded access to people in need, including the immediate free passage of medical supplies. Yet many parties demonstrate complete disregard for their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law. And in some cases, parties to conflict deliberately withhold basic necessities for military gain, manipulate humanitarian access for political reasons, and target civilians and use tactics designed to cause them the greatest harm, for example, through the use of explosive weapons in populated areas with devastating consequences. Impunity is at the heart of the problem, i.e. the lack of accountability for even the most egregious violations that would amount to war crimes or crimes against humanity. Indeed, there is nothing more empowering to perpetrators than knowing that they will not be held accountable for their crimes. The root causes of the rise of ISIL in Syria and Iraq, with such utter disdain for the minimum requirements of humanity, can be debated in many ways. But the complete impunity that has characterized the 4-year war in Syria is the milieu in which terrorist groups thrive, wreaking havoc on the lives of civilians. And as the chair of the Syria Commission of Inquiries has said, terrorism is not the cause, but the result of the war in Syria that has raged on with impunity. So defeating ISIL and other violent extremist groups will require not only robust security operations, but that should not overshadow the need also for a concerted fight against impunity, to hold all perpetrators accountable, including government and other parties in the conflict, and that requires enlightened, bold political leadership. Meanwhile, the humanitarian imperative compels aid workers to stay and deliver, and to deal with all parties to a conflict, including armed groups, even if they are designated terrorists. And we must improve our security management and risk mitigation measures so that we can work in areas under the control of terrorists and other armed actors that have little regard for humanitarian principles and norms. But humanitarians are also up against a strident and sweeping security narrative of counterterrorism initiatives of governments, including many of the most generous donors to global humanitarian appeals. States clearly have a vital responsibility to provide safety and security to their people. But the security measures and counterterrorism operations should not come at the expense of human rights and international humanitarian law, including to protect civilians and those hors de combat and fully preserve humanitarian access to people in need. Third, the stress is also coming from the funding side. Humanitarian actors are being asked to do more for more people than ever before. The demand for humanitarian assistance has risen to unprecedented levels, with the number of people in need tripling since 2004 to over 100 million, and the humanitarian funding requirements increasing by more than sixfold during the same period, reaching a record $7.9 billion at the end of 2014. This is due to the rising cost of response, the effect of conflicts being more protracted, especially in displacements, and deepening environmental vulnerability due to the impact of climate change, which is already being felt in some parts of the world. At the same time, the generous funding, $9 billion in 2014, provided by international donors, is not keeping pace with growing needs. Forecasts predict that inequality, vulnerability, and marginalization and needs will continue to grow significantly over the next 25 years, setting us on a trajectory that is clearly unsustainable. The recent surge in needs is largely accounted for by the conflict in Syria, which is now going into its 5th year. At the start of the war, we were talking about 1 million people in need. After 4 years of unrelenting violence and well over 200,000 deaths, 12.2 million people inside the country are now in need. 6.8 million are displaced. An additional 3.8 million have crossed the border into neighboring countries as refugees. As with all armed conflicts triggered by decisions or by the indecisiveness of leaders, it didn't have to happen this way. With enlightened political leadership, the crisis could have been prevented or resolved at a much earlier stage. And the failure has meant human suffering and devastation on a colossal scale, as well as a huge toll on global finances. The Syria appeal has gone from $348 million at the first launch in 2012 to $2.2 billion at the beginning of 2014 and $2.9 billion at the beginning of this year. And there are other protracted and complex emergencies that require over $1 billion this year. Iraq at $2.2 billion, South Sudan at $1.2 billion. The 2015 humanitarian appeal for 22 countries spanning 12 major crises total over $15 billion, and this is not including the ongoing response to the Ebola crisis in West Africa. And it is not that traditional donors are giving less. In fact, they have given more and more every year. But the growth in needs has simply outpaced their ability to foot the bill. It is clear that the established means of financing humanitarian appeals has reached an impasse. Something bold and innovative has to be done if the multilateral humanitarian system is to avoid chronic underfunding while also finding ways to be more efficient and effective. And it is against this backdrop that the Secretary General has decided to ask a high-level panel to produce recommendations on how more funding can be mobilized more predictably and over a longer term, from traditional and innovating funding mechanisms to address the growing gap, and also to address how the humanitarian system can use available resources in a more cost-effective way, including through more robust risk management and preparedness. The high-level panel on financing will take up its task in the context of a much broader process that the Secretary General has already launched. In May 2016, in Istanbul, Turkey, he will convene a World Humanitarian Summit to spell out the future vision for humanitarianism. And leading up to this unprecedented gathering of all stakeholders, governments, civil society, humanitarian organizations, private sector, and the affected people, a series of regional consultations is being held to generate inclusive dialogue in different parts of the world to reach out way beyond the familiar horizon to new actors and partners. There have been 5 regional consultations so far, the latest in Amman, Jordan, earlier this week for the Middle East region. 3 more are planned, followed by global consultations in Geneva in November this year, to take stock of all the ideas generated and provide input into the Secretary General's report that will be submitted to the May 2016 summit. And there are other key regional and global events that will feed into the summit process and outcome, most importantly, the 32nd International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent in December. And there are online consultations open to everyone with an interest in humanitarian work. The initial expectation was that the World Humanitarian Summit would be a dialogue among past, present, and future humanitarians, among those within the system as we know it, as well as those outside who are also engaged in humanitarian action. But through the regional consultations in the run-up to the summit, informed by the growing challenges humanitarians face on the ground, which I have briefly described today, it has become clear that the dialogue must also be about an appeal to the larger international community that seems to have lost sight of the very notion of our shared humanity. Indeed, it is a sad indictment of our world that the number of people needing life-saving assistance and protection from violence continues to grow every year. Humanitarian aid is under fire because this world needs more of it and can't provide it. In other words, humanity is under fire. The tide must be turned. We must not lose sight of our goal, to bend the curve so that global humanitarian needs do not go unanswered and in the longer run are reduced. And this is a task not just for humanitarians, but for all, for development actors to invest more in reducing risks and protecting gains, and maybe most of all, for political leaders at national, regional, and international levels to muster the courage and wisdom to end conflicts and prevent new ones from breaking out. And all of this must be underpinned by a commitment to resuscitate the notion of our shared humanity, which has been left to wither for far too long. And this, I believe, should be the appeal we must make at the World Humanitarian Summit, and I do hope that all of us here will be a part of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this interesting and extensive overview. I would like to give the word to Yves Daccord and for your short opening statement.
Very good. Good morning. You don't mind if I'm standing in front of you? Just for this beginning. Good morning to all of you. I'm very glad to be here. I'm glad for two reasons. One, because the questions about humanitarian aid under fire is absolutely critical and spot on. It is. We feel it. We've heard it. We know that people are suffering. They're suffering more. There is more pressure. And also, B, because I think this setup, the way you have organized it, with a good combination of professional coming from all different elements, part of society, and also students and civil society, is exactly the setup that we need. This is great. I also heard you, Kyung-wha, when you said it's time for bold action, right? And I would really encourage us to maybe to start with to ask ourselves the right questions. It will help us. And maybe not to be too complacent a little bit about ourselves, humanitarian. I think we have first to grasp with this idea that it's possible that people outside of this room do not perceive us as special as we think we are. Maybe less and less so. And we have to start to grasp this idea. I think we should start to be careful to not continue to have discussion among ourselves how special we are and how people should realize how special we are. Maybe we're not considered anymore as special. And by the way, we should also look at the world in which we operate. We are not the only one suffering from that. Look at health worker. 10 years of enormous pressure. I don't see any improvement when it comes to health worker. I'm not talking about humanitarian, I'm talking about health worker in every country, being under pressure. Look at Syria, look at Congo, look at Central African Republic. Look at journalists, different set of people. Look at what's happening to them in terms of access to difficult places. Look at what's happening right now when we talk about Islamic State. This is the places where there's just not one journalist being able today to tell us what's happening there. Look at northeast Nigeria. I don't hear any journalist being able to explain us what's happening. Not because they don't want, but they have lost their ability to get access. I think we have to ask ourselves the right questions. So what do we see? A, we see a world in which I think there is an absolute lack of international convergence when it comes to deal with global issues and mainly conflict. It's tough, it's sad, but it's true, right? We see how difficult it is for the Security Council right now to take decisions which are meaningful when it comes to impact the life of people, when it comes to security. Right or wrong, it's not a critics, it's facts, right? I think it's a time where the world is in transition. So states are in competition between each other. Ukraine has an impact on Syria. Syria has an impact on Libya. Libya has an impact on Nigeria for different reasons. This is the world in which we operate, and it's a world which is difficult. So I'm not saying right or wrong, but I'm just saying let's also be careful not to dream a world right now which is not exactly the world in which we will operate. I think we should dream of what could happen, but I think we should be careful about also not dreaming a world where, in fact, the Security Council, we can ask them to do a lot of things, but they won't be able to perform unless they change the way they are running. And it won't happen in the next years. So let's be clear about it. So that's one element. So what are the questions we should ask ourselves? And that's my message. And it's also a very tough message for my own organization. And here, please take it as one perspective. It's one perspective among another. And you can have different perspectives. My perspective is coming from the International Community of the Red Cross. We're working together with our colleagues of Red Cross, Red Crescent, and some of you in very difficult places. And I would like to say 3 questions. The first one is, what is our added value when it comes to, in fact, working, especially in situation of violence, armed conflict, major crisis. And here, one of my calls will still be about access. I think we really have to slightly unpack the question of access. And I would argue today, in the world we are living in, and possibly in the world we live in tomorrow, you might have entire area which should be cut off from not only humanitarian, but the international community as such. So access seems to me even more important than it was before. It seems to me that access just not to gain access to people affected, but it's to try to stay in close proximity with people. It is. It's not only a gesture of solidarity, it's also a gesture of trying to understand the evolution of their need, their coping mechanism. It's trying to do, and Kyung-wha was very clear, trying to do not only assisting people, but also trying to protect them. To do that, you have to be in close proximity. You have to do that. And I would argue, when you want to access and be in close proximity, you cannot just do close proximity through your partner. It means also you as an organization, sometimes you have to be yourself with your own people. You have to have this combination of international and national response. The national response, the local response is a critical one. But when a situation is extremely difficult, you have to bring together an international response. So what is our added value? And I would argue also that in a world in which we operate, dialogue will be even more central than it was. You want to dialogue with non-state armed group, you want to dialogue with government. I can see in my organization is not because we are the ICRC or because we are the Red Cross that right now we have any tractions when we want to dialogue with Islamic State or with the Taliban or with government. Our traction is because we are in close proximity, because we know what's happening, because we understand. So our legitimacy will be more and more linked with the fact that we are able to be there and to understand what's happening. So close proximity also gives you legitimacy. Doesn't mean access, but legitimacy to engage with all stakeholders. And we need to be able to engage with non-state armed groups, even the most difficult one. We need to be engaging with government, even the most difficult one, to be able to discuss truly humanitarian affairs and questions and international humanitarian law on the spot when it happens. First question, added value. What is our added value? Second questions, which is, I think, a critical one when we think about humanitarian affairs. The second question is the level of risk that we are ready to tolerate. We, not them, we as an organization, we as humanitarian. And it's a very tricky question. We have to agree, possibly, that in the years to come, we will have to take a bit more risk. We have to agree that maybe we'll have more people kidnapped. It's very difficult to accept that. How do we do that? How do we deal with that? But it's a question which is central. And I'm saying that in a world where, if you talk about kidnapping, I still have 3 colleagues which are kidnapped right now in Syria. But when I discuss with my own team in Syria, in my team in Damascus, just to start with, or in Aleppo, at least half of them, in their family, they have people who are kidnapped, which has nothing to do with Red Cross or humanitarian. So we have also to balance sometimes our own reality with the reality of the people. So what is the level of risk we are ready to do? And I know it's a difficult one. It's not a perfect one. All of us have a responsibility toward our staff, toward our organization, but we need to be able to put that on the table and just make sure that the response is not just that we outsource the risk to the partner. What is the risk that we are ready to take as organization? And the third one, I think, is a critical question if you want to talk about humanitarian access, humanitarian aid under fire, is what is our human resource policy? We would say, what are you talking? Human resource policy right now here? Yeah, because it's about people, our people. And what is, for me, in my own organization, right now the most challenging is to have a real new people management policy, which will allow to have diversity and serious diversity in the organization. Right now, if you are European national, to deploy yourself in Iraq or in Syria is extraordinarily difficult, even if you are Red Cross, Red Crescent, right? It's too risky for most of you, most of us. So if I want to have a direct access, I need to have the right nationalities, the right people, just to start with, without even talking about the right competences. So diversity is critical. We need to talk about that on the table. In a world which will be very polarized, where in fact part of country and citizen of this country, even if they work with us, won't be able to deploy with us. So how do we do that? So a real people management policy. And also, not just about having the right people in the organization, but also giving them the space. Because most likely in the world in which we operate, our people on the ground, they will have less time to assess because of security, because of pressure. And they will have less time to discuss with us at headquarters, do you agree or not, whatever. They will have to take decision, engage the organization more quickly. So it's not just people management and human resources, but it's also how do we live and train, coach, help, and in fact also organize ourselves to let our people on the front line to engage the organization, and sometimes maybe make mistakes. So that's the three questions I think we should be able to respond. It will help us to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yves Daccord, for that interesting statement and very lively. I would like to ask you, Mr. Petritsch, we heard asking the right questions, finding pertinent answers. You have vast experience in the field of diplomacy. You've experienced years ago, decades ago, in Bosnia, Herzegovina, in the negotiations of this conflict. We would like to hear your opinions and observations.
As always.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for including me in this Congress here. Actually, now to follow as the third speaker after two very impressive presentations is kind of difficult, but I'm going to try my best. I would like to give you, first of all, and there are 2 points which I would like to raise. The first is a more general one, the overall global situation in which humanitarian action takes place, actually. And the second one is more specific. It's about my experience in the Balkans, in particular in Bosnia-Herzegovina as the international civilian administrator there. Now, the second point is clearly about how to end a war and how to come to a close with humanitarian action and move on to reconstruction and development. But let me first address the global political changes, which I believe are very important in order to understand the mounting challenges that were presented right now here at this Congress. Now, for me, there are 3 landmark dates which have worked as game changers to end the bipolar nuclear confrontation in 1989. Of course, the end of the division, the bipolarity, the end of the Cold War, 1998. Then 2001, 9/11, and the ensuing war on terror. And then 2014, where the two or twin challenges, let me put it this way, emerged the end of the post-Cold War era with the crisis surrounding and inside of Ukraine, and in the wider Middle East, ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, and the attraction also that it has on Western youth. Clearly one could add, and this is a reference to the funding dilemma, of course also to the financial crisis, which plays a very important role. Now, definitely 9/11 was a turning point affecting very heavily humanitarian action. Let me give you one example. In Afghanistan, where these blurring lines between the military and the diplomatic had a great impact, because the war there was of course not ended. Non-state actors went on to play a very important role there. And then the Western conceived approach with the so-called regional reconstruction teams, where both the military and the civilian side and the humanitarian side were involved, a very problematic issue which impacted heavily on the humanitarian space. Now, the new multipolar world, after this kind of unipolar moment in the 1990s, of course, has irreversibly affected the post-1945 international system, United Nations, Bretton Woods systems, and so on. Why? I mean, there are several reasons, of course, but more and more so, particularly the Global South, is seeing the current international system lacking in fair representation, in equal participation, and in inclusiveness. And there are 4 significant developments of global proportions. We have now a new regional and global players. I just give you the acronym BRICS. And we have a relative decline of the global West. That has led immediately after the start of the financial crisis to find a new global steering instrument, and the G20 came into being. Now, the third significant development that I see is the proliferation of armed non-state actors, the proliferation of asymmetric conflicts. While we had to deal with proxy conflicts during the times of the Cold War, we do now have a far more blurred situation that clearly impacts a lot on humanitarian action. Now, the geography of conflicts was already mentioned, and this is my next point within my first part. They're, of course, well known, and I don't need to repeat them, from Ukraine to Syria and beyond. Now, that clearly presents for humanitarian action a very complex situation, how actually to navigate between the multiplicity of actors, political actors, legal actors, illegal actors, international and, of course, regional actors. Now, one of the big challenges clearly is that we have weak and dysfunctional states that cannot protect their population. That's the reason why, actually, in very close vicinity to the intervention in Kosovo and in Yugoslavia, the idea of the responsibility to protect, was launched. And we see what the future will bring. I believe it is a very important and a very innovative idea. It was also included in 2005 in the UN toolbox, if I may say so, although it's not actually an instrument, it's more a principle. But it is slowly becoming, and there I believe we need to work together, part of the global order. But how this is going to be, of course, needs to be seen. Now, let me move on to my second issue, which is a more specific, and that is how to end a war, how to transit from conflict to reconstruction and then on to development. Clearly, it is the Yugoslav experience which I'm referring to in this context, we need to see this kind of complex web of military aggression and civil war. In a way, it was the first in this intensity and also length that the Yugoslav drama evolved, with a war within a war to topple it all off. Now, a total breakdown of state institutions, and I still remember how difficult it was at a time for both the international troops there, the UN peacekeeping forces, where there was no peace to keep, and where after the end of the Cold War, clearly a new definition of what UN peacekeeping actually means came into being, was not very successful in former Yugoslavia, but I think the lessons that were learned there now have informed the subsequent peacekeeping missions of the United Nations. Now, the result of this terrible conflict is well known. In the middle of Europe, more than 4 years of war and conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina alone, a whole 10 or 12 years in the former Yugoslavia altogether, 2 million IDPs and refugees, 90% of the economy and the infrastructure were destroyed, and the war actually was stopped from the outside. The so-called humanitarian intervention took place in former Yugoslavia, and I believe when we talk about the not very impressive track record of humanitarian intervention, also its abuses when we think of Iraq, we still need to say that actually it was quite a success that took place in the former Yugoslavia. Clearly, that was provided by the Dayton negotiations, by the Dayton Peace Accords, US-led. That was the height of the unipolar moment in world politics, if I may say so, in a very specific geopolitical environment where in Europe we had an emerging web of important regional organizations, clearly the move from the European Community to the European Union with the Maastricht Treaty in 1993, in the middle of the conflict. Of course, the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, now very active and increasingly involved in Ukraine, and a web of other organizations like the Council of Europe, or of course also the military arm, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, for me, the most crucial issue and point to end the war there, to paraphrase Richard Holbrooke's account on the peace negotiations in Dayton, was the fact that there existed from the outset what I would call a European perspective. And that is something which is missing in most of the conflicts. What do you do if a conflict ends? What is the future? What are the perspectives? And that is, I believe, a lesson that we can learn. Without regional organizations, there is no chance really to create a sustainable peace, a sustainable absence of conflict. The Dayton Accords, of course, had some guiding principles which I would like to briefly refer to because I consider them very important. Of course, it's to restore human security in the first place, to restore basic services, to prepare a safe and secure environment, not the least for peace implementation for the humanitarian actors, civilian actors at state and non-state, to stop the impunity. That was mentioned already in Madame Kang's presentation as well, a very important thing, to eventually move on to what I would vaguely describe as reconciliation efforts. And of course, to establish basic human rights for the refugees, the returnees. This was one of the major and greatest and biggest efforts to bring back from these 2 million, which is half of the population of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the refugees and the IDPs, of which about 1 million were actually resettled or brought back to the original homes or resettled in the wider area of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And there, an important improvement in international humanitarian law is that Dayton stipulates the right to return, the right to the return of your property. Very important preconditions for a pacification, clearly. The second point of those 5 main features which I would like to mention is reconstruction, both housing, infrastructure, economic, I have briefly referred to. The third point is, of course, institution building. All the public institutions were basically annihilated. They did not exist any longer. And clearly, judiciary, rule of law as the core of the state building effort. And it was no less than a very ambitious state building effort that was put in based on the Dayton Accord. The coordination was done there, and this is also a novel development, by an ad hoc organization, the Office of the High Representative, with massive and very invasive powers, which has and had a very close relationship with the local stakeholders on the one hand, and clearly with the international organizations. The relatively small role of the United Nations was extremely important, clearly also the specialized organizations, UNHCR and so on. We had a very concerted effort put in order to coordinate our peace implementation efforts. Now, Dayton ended the war there. I believe this is the historic success of the United States as the lead nation in the negotiations. On the other hand, when I now look back 20 years after, the post-conflict reconstruction was positive, but the state-building effort, there you can see the limits. Yeah? States can only be built from the inside. You need constructive stakeholders, and the international community can only assist. This is a bit the sobering conclusion that I draw from the very ambitious beginning when we were engaged in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Petritsch. I would like to ask the other 2 panelists. We heard about the example of the Balkan Wars. You mentioned that in your opinion, the European perspective and regional involvement was key in solving this conflict. Yves Daccord, do you have something to add to that?
No, I totally agree with what Wolfgang has said about also the perspective, right? What worries me today is, and what is a game-changing, is the speed. What has changed compared to 10 years ago is the speed in which things are happening. And the disconnection between the speed and the acceleration, and then the tool we have at disposal. Let me make 2 examples. Nigeria. Who thought 1 minute that we would have a situation so dramatic even 6 months ago, and the situation would not just be northeast, but will be truly a regional question, both in terms of humanitarian catastrophe, Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Cameroon, and also in terms of security, having now Chadian troops moving within Nigeria with all the questions related to that. And what is the mechanism to deal with it? Very, very difficult, right? In a very, very quick element. Who thought that Libya will now be possibly the 3rd or the 2nd Khalifa, right? Very quickly. How do we deal with that? How internationally are we dealing with that? And here, one thing is, what I would find interesting, when you look at humanitarian affairs, you also do have to look at in a larger context. And I think one of the questions, the missing link seems for me right now really diplomatic. Where are Where are the diplomats? Okay, we have very distinguished diplomats with us today. But really, I'm seriously questioning in a sense of, in a world where things are moving so quickly, what are the tools where you can really very quickly find some solution or try to carve solutions? There is a disconnect between the speed in which it's happening and in fact some of the tools to be able to connect with that. I think this is a big concern. So we are talking about humanitarian affair. Everybody wants to humanitarian affair as almost a solution sometimes of a lack of a political dynamic. We talk a lot about security, rightly so, but there is somewhere missing. Where is the political discussions? In fact, at the time I would argue, and that's what Wolfgang told us, I would argue that what made the difference in the Balkan with the plus and the minus was not the security, was the politics, was the diplomatic, was the fact that there was, in a way, a try to propose a solution. Painful, but there was a solution. Today, this part is totally missing. And I think that's exactly what we have to ask our the questions. And then I'm not saying it's the mistake of this one or this one, but when we think that, it's critical that we understand that today there is a total disconnect between the problems, the speed in which the problems, they are more and more regional, that's very true. There are very few humanitarian crises which can be located only in one context. Also because of the media, because of the social media, because of the dynamic, the connectivity. Amazing. Look at what's happening in Yemen. It's very, very complex, very fragmented. But what's happening in Yemen is immediately have an impact right now across Middle East. Has an impact on Saudi, has an impact on Iran, has a very deep impact in Somalia, as an example. So, and this is the world in which we operate. And at the same time, not having the right tool, possibly. So what do we do? That's maybe the critical question.
Dr. Kang, political discussion is missing today. What is your analysis of that fact?
I think I completely agree with Yves. I think when bad things happen, as they quickly down spirals into massive scales of violence, but there isn't the political initiative that could stop that momentum and down spiraling further. And we're seeing this happening in all of these conflicts. So there's really no end in sight to any number of these crisis situations that we're dealing with. And I think at the crux of the matter is the dysfunctionality of the Security Council. And we've talked decades about the Security Council is non-representative, first of all, and doesn't solve the big crisis of the day. And yes, we go to the Security Council to brief. I just did on the CAR. We're doing one on the Ukraine. We do a monthly briefing to the Security Council on the humanitarian situation in Syria, as mandated by 2 resolutions. But it's almost become routine. What does that matter in terms of the political decision-making that is required to turn things around? And so after months, yes, it's important to have that platform to present the picture as fully and robustly as we can to those decision makers, but where is that push that prompts them into action? And it's not, humanitarians can't create that. It's really the political leadership in these critical capitals that have to see the self-interest, the enlightened self-interest in doing something about this. Because I think at the end, look how it's all coming back to haunt us. Look how all the conflict not just has regional dynamics, but global dynamics. When we're talking about foreign fighters now joining, it's a global challenge now, and these crises they learn from each other. You see terribles happening. The beheadings happening in this part of the world, and almost the next day, it's copycatted in other parts. So we make that point that the political leadership has to see that in the end, this is going to come back and haunt everyone. And that message has to be made as forcefully as we can. And I think, that when we started the World Humanitarian Summit process, I think even on this, we're always trying to catch up. It was launched as sort of a futuristic. How do we become more inclusive? How do we bring in the larger humanitarian crowd into the fold so that we can be more effective, we can leverage each other's strength, we can bring in the private sector. But the challenges on the ground have been such that we're now saying this has to be an opportunity where we make that cry from the heart to the non-humanitarians out there.
Thank you. Time is flying, so I would ask the audience if there are any urgent questions already, or if we should continue here on the panel. Yes, please. Yes, microphone.
It's coming.
It's coming.
My name is Werner Kerschbaum. I work for the Red Cross. I have a couple of questions. Is that okay?
Yeah.
First of all, to Mrs. Kang, you mentioned that the total spending is $15 billion US dollars for humanitarian aid worldwide. This is 0.1% of the EU GDP. So how can that constitute a problem? Even if the amount doubles in the future, it will only be 0.2% of the European GDP, not mentioning the worldwide GDP. You started to have a few ideas about something bold has to be done. Can you sort of give us a little bit more insight on that? If we bold leadership, is it bold governance? I know it's not the responsibility of the humanitarians, but I would be interested what your ideas are. And a question then to Yves. How do we, you said the level of risk we can tolerate. You touched on that question, that was your second question. How do we assess risk in humanitarian organizations? And the last question, you also talked, Yves, about diversity and more responsibility. That's the way I understood it, moving more responsibility to the bottom of the hierarchy. Yes. Do we have to come up with different organizational models in terms of networks or other organizational models?
Thank you.
Thank you. I think the $15 billion figure is the figure that we start the year with. Clearly, if these crises go on further, that amount will grow. And as you're absolutely right, in the larger scheme of things, it's only a small piece of the overall development assistance, whether you're talking about individual countries, EU, or donor countries as a whole. So there has to be some flexibility within the overall development assistance, and I'm saying development assistance in the larger scheme that is partly humanitarian emergency assistance pocket and the longer-term development assistance pocket. Currently, donors are very, very strict in this division between what they can do to give to humanitarian assistance and what they give to development assistance, mostly. I think donors are now seeing that divide has to be broken down. There has to be greater flexibility between the two pockets, not because we want to draw in more development money to humanitarian assistance, but because that makes so much more sense, for example, to have more investment in early recovery and humanitarian assistance that's just not a stopgap, but longer term, not just 1 year, but 2 years and 3 years, so that it is not just life-saving, but also livelihood building and resilience building. So there's a lot of thinking that is required to combine the two pockets in a way that not only saves money, but in the end, a lot more effective. But another sobering aspect of those figures is I think it's only about 5% of overall humanitarian assistance that goes into preparedness. Even with that small pocket, what goes on to preparedness is even so small. And so there's a huge rethinking on the part of donors to break down that barrier, but that requires the building of a whole new set of funding mechanisms. And I think that's what we're looking for as one of those bold ideas about the future of humanitarian financing.
Thank you. Yves?
Quickly, I think the question, Werner, would deserve an entire seminar, but just to make three things. On bold, can I start with that? It would be very useful already that we would call a cat among us. Because frankly, I don't know how you are, but we are living in a sectors called humanitarian sectors, and we call it as a family, a community, a sectors, whatever, which is good to call it like that. Gives this impression that we're all together, and we are today sitting together, but it's also very competitive between each other. The competition is high, and it will not go down, it will go higher, right, among us, because there won't be that much money. We understood that. And I'm saying it won't solve the problems, but put things on the table sometimes help when you want to discuss and unpack what are we talking about. That will be something already bold, which will help. And that lead me to the risk assessment. I'm not pleading for a risk assessment methodology specific. I mean, all of us have that. What I'm saying is it's useful that it is discussed more openly within organization, including with your board. We are all leaders among us, but also with our staff. That it's more clear. What are we requesting? What does that mean? What are the risks we are ready to tolerate? And the risks are, of course, physical. They're also reputational. They're also financial. They are political. And I think it's extremely important to be able to discuss that. It's not an easy one. It's a very complicated one, but I think that's what it is. And I think we do all assess risk. That's very clear. But the question is not about assessment. The question is about, are we able to discuss it? To really bring an understanding in the organization of how far do we want to push. I think it is an issue. And I'm saying that because most of the organization who have staff on the ground, they will continue to have security incidents. They will continue to have kidnapping. And this is shocking. So what do? Do we say, okay, this region are off-grid, some of them are, or are we ready to continue? But what is the price? I think we need really to have a discussion, and first and foremost within our organization. If I look at MSF, critical question for you, MSF, critical question for the ICSC and for the Red Cross, critical question for some of the UN partners. So I think it's something we need to be discussed. Third, without being too long, when it comes to diversity of the staff, and I agree with what you said, it's not just about diversity of the staff. Most likely, over the next coming years, in the world in which we operate, which is also rather unpredictable, what you can see immediately is you do have to have different organization model within the same organization. So this is what is new. What is new is not one organization model or the other. Most likely within each organization, you would have to have different organization model. So you have an organization model which is very clearly geared towards major emergency. When emergency happens, you have one system of command, very clear line of command, which is very solid. But then when you work in a very networking time, where you need to really grasp, takes months of negotiation just to move on, or in a very low intensity conflict, you are in a different set of situation, and possibly a different set also of leaders and people. So I think we need to be a little bit more subtle in the way we are managing that, and in truly adapt our system, and not make our people also suffering too much on system. And last but not least, also questions to our donors. And I really thought what you said, Kyung-wha, about counterterrorism, something important. I have a very, very bad memory of the global war against terror. Not only what it meant in terms of polarization, but what it meant for all of us. So the pressure we went through. And I see the global war on terror 2.0 arriving very soon, right? In terms of dynamic, but also in terms of counter-terrorist measure. And here we'll have to be very careful, because if we want to be flexible, if we want to be trusted and accepted, and at the same time we have to respond questionnaire about the color of the socks of our partner, or the names of the people we're trying to help, in terms of confidence building, being accepted, that we'll have to be very careful.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? Are there any on the Twitter wall? No? Yes, please.
Well, let me just echo some of the issues that Yves put forward, and also Assistant Secretary Kang. I think the main challenge really is the acceleration of the crisis and the multiplicity that we are confronted with. Old crises are not resolved, old conflicts are not resolved, and new ones are added to all this. And that poses, of course, a very problem for the policy space, so to speak, because politics is lagging behind. You know, the organizational setup is actually not fit for the challenges of the 21st century. That's a big issue. Clearly, the global war on terror has made things so much more worse. Yeah? Not just for the humanitarian side, but also for everything politics. You know, diplomacy is very much affected by it. Now, and this goes directly to the core of our Western values. Whereas freedom was number one, particularly in the United States, now it's security.
Absolutely.
But it is an ill-fated concept of security, which is very much military, very much policing, and not appealing to the positive strains in a society. Yeah? And that is clearly connected to the wider issue of dignity that you have mentioned, also that was mentioned here, which is not really addressed. So what's the way out? I mean, we have to go on clearly to work with the facts on the ground, but on the other hand, we need to get out of this reactive mode into a proactive mode. And that means preventive diplomacy. Yeah? That means, as a second issue, very important one, we need to help and assist in building regional organizations. Problems can only be resolved in the regional context. That was already a big issue when Afghanistan and Pakistan, AFPAC, was created. It's clearly the issue in Ukraine, can only be resolved in the wider context of dealing with the European Union, Russia, and clearly with Ukraine and the neighboring countries. So that is, and here in Europe we do have, as I've mentioned, the OSCE. The OSCE, as any other organization, as the United States, is of course a members-driven organization. And it can only be as good as the members allow it to be. Yeah? So these are some of the issues that need to be addressed in a far more forward-looking way. And one last point that I would like to make is, of course, the intimate interconnectedness of the global and the local. Yeah? And this is not just the new media, but it is, of course, very much an issue that we do not, that is underestimated, that we do not deal properly with it.
Thank you, Mr. Petritsch. If you wanted to mention something, and then there's another question back there that we still want to take. So
just 2 minutes to say at least one good news. If you look at humanitarian aid and humanitarian actions, my sense is over the last 10 years there have been improvement in some field. I would say you can always discuss, but if you take a bit of distance, I would say in general, you can see there have been a remarkable improvement when it comes to disaster risk management, when it comes to natural disasters since the tsunami. Let's remember how shocking it was. And I would say today, most of the communities around the world, not all of them, but some of the communities around the world, especially in Asia, they have worked remarkably. They have found good collaboration with, in fact, their states. It was not always perfect, but it worked. You had Red Cross, you had UN, you had NGOs, you have a lot of communities who have really worked well, have equipped themselves. So I think you can see, yes, there are areas where truly, when the host government or the host authority are in a situation to provide basic services, things have improved. That's clear. What we have to develop is a situation where host governments are not in a situation to provide basic services. Not because they, frankly, like Central African Republic, you can ask them to do, they are very limited means to do so. So it's nice to support them, but it's very limited. Or because they are at war, and they won't want to do that. And here I think the question is, what does that mean for politics? We've seen that, and I think we have to be very clear, and I think politics needs to really find different way. But also, what does it mean for us? And here I would really say, in that type of situation, I really call for back to basic, which is you have to have humanitarian actors which are ready to demonstrate and to be challenged on a daily basis, really their principle. We have them to be radically principled, radically impartial. This is the moment where there is no trust. There is a moment where people will really see if the humanitarian action is really based on the needs and not just on a political agenda. Right? This is the moment where we have to be dramatically, radically principled. impartial, neutral, independent. So we have to know also, we as humanitarians, agree that there are different types of situations, but there are moments where we have to also take the stand to be really, really, really radically principled.
Thank you. There's a question back there? Okay.
You working? So my name is Mario Thaler from MSF Austria. And we've heard in the beginning opening words that this Congress is about reflection and self-criticism. Now we've heard Yves asking 3 questions, which we're pretty much having the same questions or posing the same questions to our organization as well. But what about the self-criticism of the UN agencies? So I do have a question dedicated to Mrs. Kang. Not talking about the dysfunctionality of UN Security Council and so on. What about the failure of operating indirectly in the field of UN agencies? So talking about what Yves mentioned, access. So just naming South Sudan, where a UN agency more or less hiding in campsites for protection of civilians and kind of neglecting hundred thousands outside of these camps. So what about the late response, the very, very late response in the Central African Republic? So I think the question is, how will you go into these discussions of the World Humanitarian Summit? Will you tackle this dysfunctionality of UN agencies? Maybe with one exception of WFP, who is really one of the very few agencies who is still close to the people. All the others, or we personally, or we as organizations see, they're actually quite distant from the people.
Thank you very much. I take that criticism with a great deal of humanity, and I see the problems of institutional, territorial competition and the lack of ability to go as far as some of our NGO partners go, such as MSF, such as ICRC, because we have a security system that is much more limiting than other humanitarian organizations have. And that's a problem for us. And those humanitarians within the UN system is constantly in discussion with our security experts so that they can loosen the rules a little bit so that we can go further into the field. And that's a constant challenge within the system. I think the South Sudan case of the lack of protection outside of the POC is a very, very legitimate question. And you know, the humanitarians are in constant dialogue with the peacekeepers because they have a very robust peacekeeping mandate, but the challenge of the POC sites was such a new one. The peacekeepers have never dealt with such a situation. And on the humanitarian side, we've never dealt with a situation where we had to go into a mission site to do our humanitarian work. You had a situation where MSF included, working under the protection within mission sites to undertake our humanitarian work. It's a challenge still. Every situation, every POC site inside South Sudan is different. And the key is trying to find individualized solutions for each of these POC sites, but also to expand that outreach of the security protection that is needed for the POC outside, for these many more IDPs outside the POC site. It's an ongoing challenge, but we need constant criticism from our NGO partners to keep us on track on this, and also the pressure from the humanitarians on the peacekeepers to do this. CAR, I think you're very legitimate that the humanitarian response was late, but I can assure you that since the declaration of the L3, the presence, the humanitarian footprint has really increased over twofold. So, I think we have a setup that is up to the challenge currently. But again, in the security sector, there's a lot more to go. I've just heard in the news that the French have announced that they're going to start reducing the troops, the Sangari troops, and basically, transferring that responsibility to MINUSCA. So MINUSCA, the UN peacekeeping mission, will be ultimately in charge of security for the whole of the country, a country that has absolutely zero capacity at this point in terms of its own security entities. Just a gendarmerie that's just nascent, the former army that used to be nowhere, nobody knows where that has gone. So there is, institution building is very, very critical in a situation like the CAR, because it's, beyond Bangui. If you go to these areas where IDPs are in enclaves, there is almost zero state authority. So this requires a heavy international engagement, and very critically, a long-term engagement, a sustained engagement, not just for this year, next year, or 3 years, a very long-term engagement so that you really need to stay and build, help to build those, fundamental state institutions that are required. The sorry history of the CAR has been a repetition of these half-hearted engagements and leaving, and the country falling back to bad governance and humanitarian crisis.
Thank you, Mrs. Kang. So that we all get our coffee before the next panel starts, we have to end here. I would like a very short statement of one sentence. One thing that I take out of this discussion is that the political discussions are missing. There's a lack of political ambition in getting involved to solving humanitarian crisis. For all of us, please in one sentence, what would you suggest us here and everybody who cares to push for change, to push for that political discussion to take on more speed and more relevance?
Us here, as we are in Austria, I think, if I may say, I think it's extreme. It seems to me Austria has a really important role to play. So I think for all Austrian around the room, I think it's great to have a Humanitarian Congress here in Austria. I think it's critical for me that Austria understands, even it's Austria, you can always discuss it's small compared to the large world, that you have a role to play. Both as a country pushing for initiative, you are a country who can think about, by the way, talking about the UN Security Council and veto rights. I know it's a long story, but you have a role to play. I think your perspective about what's happening right now in Ukraine and some of the part of the world is important. So it's also critical. And I think, last but not least, I think you can make sure that your government, but also yourself, you support also very principled humanitarian actions. I think it's a critical that, because we will have to make sure that we maintain human connections in a world where you will have area where you will have just no or very little international presence. Human connections will be central. Let's make sure we maintain. Let's make sure you have the MSF, the Red Cross, and other organizations of the world which will be there. So support them.
Okay. Just to ditto on what Yves has just said, but also to say, this is not just a dialogue among us. This has to be a dialogue vis-a-vis the political player. Absolutely fundamental that we go to the very basics and really stick to our principles, because our legitimacy is only what will enable us to do the work on the ground. But let's also force the political players to go to the very basics, which is charter responsibility of keeping. The Security Council has the primary responsibility of maintaining international peace and security. It's failing miserably. And that message has to be registered as often and as clearly as possible.
Thank you.
3 points put down here. The first one is to organize and to empower local and regional responsibility. My second point is early warning systems and prevention would go a very long way. And my third and last point is continue, everybody, to continue to pressure politics to act more swiftly and responsibly. But that, of course, presupposes a change in their mindset. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for this interesting and lively discussion.
Are you staying or you no?
I'm staying a bit.
So there is a coffee break, and we still try to start in time for the next panel. Thank you.